Anne let out a sigh of relief at the sight of Jiangxi, although it had taken her a minute or two to identify it as such. At first she thought she might have gotten lost and happened upon another village. She hadn't, though. It was the same settlement she had departed from a little less than 3 weeks ago. The only difference now was that it was, mostly, ringed by a rather imposing-looking wall. Even from this distance she could see labourers working to finish off what appeared to be the gatehouse. I did not know mortals could work so fast, she thought. Though if they had the ability to put up such an imposing ridabout, why then did they satisfy themselves with such a meagre palisade? She shook her head. It was best not to dwell on the fallacies and inconsistencies of mortals. It was in their nature to be content with their lot in life, slow and unmoving, or cultivators ever battle for more. Still, part of her lamented the fact that if the mortals had not been so cheap with their own defences, she would not have failed so greatly in her master's task. Not in her acquisition of a mortal guard, no. She had sourced 5 of such men, including one of high rank, at least for a mortal. True, each of them sported wounds that had denied them their earlier profession, but that was within the criteria laid out for her. No. The true cause of her failure lay in the delay she had incurred on her return trip. Her boast of returning within a single week had been reduced to mere empty air. And it's all their fault, she thought, glaring venomously back at the veritable train of bedraggled mortals that followed after her. Of course, it was hard to remain angry at them when they made for such a pitiful sight. Most looked dead on their feet, without even the energy to cheer now that their destination was in sight. Not that she blamed them for their lethargy. The lost collection of souls that followed her were now the survivors of villages she'd encountered on her return journey. Men, women and children that had abandoned their homes in search of safety in the city of Tenhuo. A common line of thought, it seemed. When she'd arrived at the massive city, lines of refugees from the outlying countryside had already begun to form outside the gates of processing. And Anne had little doubt that those lines would only grow in the coming months as more and more people flocked to safety. Though how many will survive the journey, this Guan does not know, she thought, her features softening slightly as she led her small army of followers towards Jiangxi. It's why a number had chosen to follow her instead of making for the city, seeing the safety gained from travelling in her immediate company as preferable to the long and perilous journey to the city. Never mind that her destination took her further, not closer to Tenhuo. Still, she was pleased to know that their approach had not gone unnoticed. From her vantage point she could see men on the walls calling down into the town, and in short order a small procession of men and women were walking out to meet her, Mei Jin at their head. Though she frowned mightily at the way they clutched their farming implements, come weapons close to hand. Certainly a degree of caution was warranted given the danger of corrupted beast attack, but surely her presence alone provided sufficient security against it. She'd only lost 2 people on the trip here after all, and that could hardly have been considered her fault. Because what manner of fools sneak out in the night in the name of cardinal relations when danger lurks behind every tree? Had the pair of would-be lovers been revived that very night to see how their families wept at their loss, this young mistress would have killed them all over again for their thoughtlessness. She shook her head, banishing the thought as the residents of Jiangxi approached. Mistress Cultivator? Mei Jin asked from his position at the fore, seemingly shocked from whatever he was about to say by her appearance. Apparently he hadn't recognized her. She would have chided him for that, were it not for the fact that she would reluctantly admit there was no small cause for it. Her dress was in tatters. She was filthy and tired. Hungry too. So hungry. And she had neither the patience nor the inclination to hide any of those afflictions for the benefit of a band of lowly mortals. Take me to the inn. See these people housed. Her words were short, commanding, which made it all the more galling when the Oxman had the audacity to hesitate. Did you not hear me? Her words had taken on a distinctly dangerous tone. The mortal shifted uncomfortably under her glare. I would like to comply, young mistress. It's just... What? She stared up at the massive man, daring him to delay her journey even a moment longer. Anne likened to consider herself a woman not easily given to wrathful outbursts, but the last few days had been taxing. Even her patience had limits. Limits the mayor of Jiangxi was testing even with his tepid resistance. He's worried there's not enough food to support your entourage. Like water draining from a cracked bowl, all the tension in the clearing dissipated instantly, as Anne registered the unexpected voice. Master! Ignoring the undignified surprised squeak in her voice, her eyes roamed around in search of the hidden master, only to freeze as she realized the powerful man's voice was coming from a small box in Zin's hands. The same technology as his mystic sanctum, she thought desperately. What poor luck. She had hoped to freshen herself and change her clothes before going to see him. She needed to put her best foot forward to wipe away the shame of her delay. Oh, the shame, for him to see her like this. Her words came out haltingly and without poise. Her thoughts ran into disarray by this unexpected turn of events. Food? Yes, food. Master Johansson's dry tone was clear, even through the distortion of the small mystic construct applied to his voice. The stuff people eat. Jiangxi has grain stores and farms, but I wager our mayor here is dubious as to whether the town can support another 1,000 mouths in the long term, he sighed. Farming's certainly not got any easier since these attacks started. Attacks that are likely only going to get worse in the coming months, as the wild beasts finish off other villages and start congregating towards the still standing ones, she realized. Hun flushed. She had not even considered such things when she had chosen to allow these refugees to accompany her. Silence reigned, and behind her she could hear the nervous shifting of the mortals that had accompanied her, which only further added to her shame. What was running through these people's minds? To have come so far and lost so much only to be turned away at the final hurdle? It would be a death sentence. Unexpectedly, her heart lurched. Would she have to... She didn't know. Beg for her master's beneficence? What could he do, though? Not even a headmaster could turn their hand and have rice fall forth. For if that were the case, what use would we have of mortals? She thought worriedly. The growing silence in the clearing was broken by the dry ponderings of Master Johansson. I must admit, I was wondering how the other villages around here were doing. Even thought of telling Zin to send a runner. Before I realized that I'd probably just get the poor sod eaten. He paused. I'm guessing that is bad out there? Ann kicked the dirt at her feet, eyes averted. It's not good. Most of the villages she'd encountered on her journey had been ravaged in one form or another, and while some had seen aid from guard patrols or fellow cultivators who had been travelling north like herself, most had simply been left to wither on the vine. The 8 families had not ranged forth to secure their lands. Instead, they remained holed up in their city, leery of leaving its boundaries with so much of their membership already left for the northern provinces. This was a foolishly short-sighted move in her opinion, for without the outlying villages to feed it, trouble would soon bloom for the city itself. She couldn't help but wonder if that was part of the arch-traitor's plan, to cut the Empire's feet out from under her. Alright, let them in. We'll have to bite into the larders for now, but I'll figure out a way to resolve this. For a moment, Ann couldn't help but wonder if she'd misheard. Only after a moment of self-reflection did she realize that she had not. Her master had agreed to aid the poor souls behind her. The tiger woman's heart leapt in her chest, even as she fought to keep her regal bearing. Something that the people behind her in no way emulated as they started to cheer. Not that she begrudged them that. They are only mortal after all. Alright, enough of that. Were it anyone else, Ann might have said Master Johansson sounded embarrassed as his voice issued forth from the box. Zing, quit fidgeting and start seeing to these people's needs. Food, shelter, all that shit. The man nodded quickly. Ann, you better get over here with that thing I told you to get. He paused. Wipe that dumb grin off your face. Don't think I've forgotten that you promised to be back before the end of the first week. We'll be having words about promising deadlines you can't keep. As soon as you brought me what you promised, you'll be back out here helping Jin sort out this mess you've tossed into his lap. Well, you're in the shit now, buddy, Kang thought, as he led his small band of fellow cripples into the hidden master's sanctum. As a captain in the 10-horse city guard, Kang was no stranger to cultivators or the strange things they got up to. In that regard, the mystic iron doors he and his fellows had been guided to, before the young mistress had dashed off like the heavenly hounds were nipping at her heels, wasn't that strange. That it was located inside what was, by all indications, a mineshaft was, though. He also doubted he was alone in being more than a mite discomforted by the wave of hot air that had washed out of the doors, as they had slid open in a manner that retroactively reminded him of the maw of a great beast. For weeks he cursed the cold, snow and damp for how they aggravated his leg, yet now he couldn't help but think they were a welcome alternative to the blazing heat that surrounded them. It was dark and gloomy within the stone halls, the path they were to follow lit by only a few overhead lights. It was not quiet, though. From deep within the blackness, he could hear the echoes of many somethings grinding, whirring and banging, though what was causing those sounds he had no idea. The only thing he did know was that he might have made a mistake in accepting the cultivator girl's strange offer all those moons ago, a thought that he was sure was echoing in more than just his own mind, as the band of cripples followed the hidden master deeper into his home. Wasn't that another oddity? Certainly Kang had expected to be greeted by someone once the tiger last left, but he hadn't expected that someone to be the master himself. Yet now the big man walked ahead of them, his massive imposing form armoured and thick as he stopped through the halls of his domain. He had said little, only entreating them to follow. That at least tracked with Kang's usual experiences with cultivators. Arrogant bastards, the lot of them, he thought. Though he couldn't help but retract that statement just a little, as another of those strange mystic doors slid open to reveal a room furnished with tables and chairs. Metal, oddly enough, but that was not what held Kang's attention. "Sit, drink, eat," the master said, gesturing to the containers of water and bowls of rice, vegetables and meat stacked high up on the table. "You boys have had quite the journey. I doubt it was easy on any of you given your injuries." Kang hesitated for just a second at the cultivator's outstretched arm, before bowing his thanks and striding forward into the room. Which was cool, he suddenly realised. The hot, heavy air of the outside giving way to a cool freshness as he stepped inside. Taking a seat, he was amazed to see that there was ice in the glasses. What was more, the glass was of an opacity and clearness he'd never seen before. Around him, he could hear his fellows making sounds of contentment as they rested their weary bodies upon the chairs, or in the case of Jan, was lowered into his chair by his brother, the stumps of his legs dangling awkwardly off the end. None of them dared to reach for the food or drink, though. Master Johansson, as the tiger lass had told them he was called, seemed confused by that fact, as he sank into a chair that should have in no way been able to hold his armoured bulk. He was a strange one to look upon. Kang had, on one occasion on the trip to Jiangxi, asked the cultivated woman what manner of half-beast her master was, if only in the hopes that he might better gauge the man's temperament. For while it was true that a man's beast nature was not the entirety of what he was, Kang had found over the years that the stereotypes held some small glimmer of truth to them. Half snakes were crafty, half oxen proud, half rat sneaky but in a manner different to half snakes, half ghosts were stubborn, half monkeys were mischievous. The list went on. It was confusing, but he found it helped. Yet the girl had gone uncharacteristically silent at his question. It seemed she didn't know, and now that Kang looked upon the man, he could see why. Whatever half-beast mark the man had, it was subtle. Certainly not in the feet, hands or ears, nor did he have horns or a tail. They would have shown even through the armour. And the girl would have known if it were in the face or the eyes. No. Whatever animal trait the man possessed that indicated his ancestral beast heritage, it was apparently well hidden. Scales around the abdomen? Kang wondered. He had known a few Snake King through the years, whose beast mark had presented in such a way, or perhaps sharpened teeth. Well, aren't you hungry? The words took him off guard, shaking him from his ponderings. He was, they all were. But all of them were wary of offending the cultivator by partaking before he did, and cultivators were very easy to offend, not to mention a study in contradictions. Just because one offered food didn't mean they were offering food. Cultivators could be a coin flip like that. So no, they wouldn't eat until the man himself did. Not that he seems in any hurry to, Kang thought, as he noted that the man had yet to remove his strange helm. Time dragged on, the delicious aroma of hot food wafting across the table. Fuck it. If I'm going to die for offending a cultivator, I prefer to do it in a full stomach. He reached out, grabbing a bowl and a pair of chopsticks before shoving the contents into his mouth with a gracelessness that would have seen his mother slap him over the head with a sandal, were she still around to see it. That did it, and soon enough every man was shoveling food into their mouths as fast as they could. A feat made slightly more difficult for one, given his single hand, but the thin man more than made up for his lacking limb with enthusiasm. All the while, Master Johansson merely watched. Finally, when his stomach was full and his thirst was quenched, Kang managed to regain his faculties enough to be embarrassed by his show of glut. This lowly one thanks Master Cultivator for the food and drink. He bowed his head. His words and actions were echoed by the other former guards around the table, but the cultivator merely waved his hand dismissively. Don't worry about it. I figured it was the least I owed you after you travelled all this way to meet me. Kang bowed again before straightening up. Now that his stomach was full, and he wasn't in danger of collapsing from exhaustion, he could actually analyse the man in front of him. Sure, he didn't have a ton to go off of, but his interactions thus far were enough for him to gauge a rough response to the man in front of him. He'd done the same many times when interacting with cultivators during his time as a guard captain. The man had been a hidden master prior to his arrival in Jiangxi. He'd had no servants. He greeted them himself, fed them, been brisk, but not rude. A rural type then, he thought, as he mentally shuffled the man into one of the many mental categories he'd developed over the years when figuring out ways to interact with cultivators. Has respect for guest rights, value self-sufficiency, has little time for pomp or pageantry. Good. That was good. The rural types tended to be a lot simpler to deal with than city or sect-born cultivators. You have quite a fortress here, Kang began with a compliment, reasonably sure that he would not be punished for speaking out of turn. Master Johansson cocked his head. It's useful enough, he allowed, though not as secure as I might like. A hairless mole the size of a horse got in last week. Claws like knives. Damn monster had 3 fabs before I put it down. By which point the damn thing is how I managed to set itself on fire. Christ, you should have heard the shrieking. Despite himself, Kang shuddered. He could well imagine the scene. It was also a firm reminder as to why cultivators, despite all the issues they caused, were a boon for the people of the Celestial Empire, and it took him a lot to say that, given he'd been crippled by one. For the audacity of impeding his entry into the city, he thought bitterly. The cultivator in question had died for that, of course. The Sect did not appreciate outsiders refusing to give face by following their laws. That didn't do him any good. He's still being tossed out onto his ass. A guard with a crippled leg was of no value to anyone. Perhaps things might have been different if he were of higher rank, but as a mere captain it was seen as more efficient to discard him and promote another. Which brings me to why you lot are out here, the cultivator continued. I mean to wait out the Empire's current troubles here in Jiangxi. To that end, I have need of a decent guard force. Kang nodded. He'd expected as much, though that begged the question. With respect, Master Cultivator, while we will be honoured to serve you, myself and my fellows are hardly in a fit state to do so. Kang knew what he wanted. That, as much as gold, had been why he'd come along on this journey. A sentiment he knew was shared by the others. None of them had said it out loud. None of them had dared to. For it was a ridiculous hope. Healers were rare. Apparently it took long years of training and incredible control for a cultivator to learn the art. Thus they were a rare and guarded resource. More to the point, restoring a severed limb or fixing something like an eye requires skill beyond that of all but the most renowned healers. People like Dai Jin, the White Fist, or He Jiang, the Jade Needle. Renowned heroes of the Empire, whose name was known by every loyal citizen and was sought by sect masters across the land. Certainly not the kind of people that would waste their valuable time on mere mortals. Yet he was still here. He still hoped for the impossible. Yeah, that's not a problem, Master Johansson drawled. Legs, arms, and sight are easy enough to fix. He pointed to the back. What's wrong with you? Kang barely heard him. He was still too busy processing what had just been said. Still, he was shaken out of it as a young gal managed to wheeze out a surprisingly loud response. Lungs, he wheezed. The cultivator just reclined in his chair, even easier than the others. Ignorant, or more likely indifferent, to his shell-shocked audience, the man continued. Now, I didn't truck you guys up here just to act as guards. I need you to train me up some locals. Mustering all the will he could, Kang managed to put his awe and hope to the side as he focused on the topic at hand, determination blazing in his heart. Admittedly, some small part of him doubted the man's claims of easily fixing his wounds. That small part was drowned out by the overwhelming majority that needed the man's words to be true. How many? Kang said instantly. As many as I can get, but let's say about 100 in the first batch of trainees. Behind him, Kang heard someone cough. That was a lot of guards for such a small town. Still. This one assumes the garrison will be intended to repel animal attacks? Kang asked. So as to allow Master Cultivator to work undisturbed. Sure. The man made a particular gesture with his hand, waggling it side to side. I assume you know how to do that. Kang nodded. The Guard of Ten Hu are indeed called upon to cull wolves or bears that threaten the surrounding towns and villages. Good. How are you with people? Kang assumed the man did not mean in matter of discourse. We are trained in how to disperse crowds or deal with bandits. The man nodded. And what about cultivators? Kang opened his mouth only to pause. No, he said finally. Master Johansson cocked his head. Really? What if one made trouble in town? We'd call another cultivator, Yang said from the back. This only means that we would call for a cultivator, Great One. If that was bothered by the interruption in any way, he didn't show it. Really? Kang resisted the urge to frown. The answer was obvious. Why was the man asking this? Was he testing them? Cultivators are above mortals, Great One, he spoke slowly. They are faster, stronger. Even the lowliest cultivator has the strength of 10 men and the reflexes of 20. If Kang didn't know any better, he might have heard the cultivator click his tongue at the response. Alright, let's imagine the local good cultivators are busy. Then we wait, Gal wheezed, before coughing. Nonetheless, the young man determinedly managed to continue on despite his poison-ravaged lungs, until the cultivator has vented their spleen. Kang gripped fist onto the table, waiting. Choosing not to act as a cultivator acted improperly. It was not always easy. The cultivator across from him sounded incredulous. So you never clash with them? What about when you're at war? My mayor said you'd raise peasant levies. That was an area Kang was more familiar with due to his relatively high rank. Levies fight other levies, Master Cultivator. They're like pawns in chess, merely a means to pressure an army into applying their cultivators to break through a line or reinforce it before it breaks. After all, while cultivators are great and powerful, they cannot be everywhere. He was quoting the scriptures now. Thus, when conquering territory, one needs mortal soldiers to hold it. Thus, in war, the common objective of clashing armies is to deplete the other's manpower. He thought the man across from him would be satisfied by his answer, but if anything, the cultivator seemed to sag. So, mortals are used as chaff in the most literal sense, huh? Kang didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. What do guards like you do when an army marches then? I assume you're more valuable than a peasant levy. We spread out and keep the peasants in line. If taking territory, we'll train up new guards in new lands. For that reason, trained guards are often kept from the fighting itself. We are valuable enough to not be wasted. Huh. So you're more like military police than real soldiers, the man murmured, mostly to himself. For his part, Kang had no idea what a police was. Then Master Johansson leaned forward, and for the first time since the conversation began, a sudden intensity seemed to enter his voice. Alright then, how would you deal with a cultivator if I asked you to? Silence reigned in the room, no one daring to speak. Bows and long spears. Hem them in, like a bear. The wheeze in the speaker's voice left no confusion as to who had spoken. Kang turned to give young Gao a warning look, but he was stopped, as Master Johansson's eyes turned to the young former guard with all the intensity of a predator sighting prey. Bows and spears? Keep them as much of a distance as you can, right? Kang heard more than saw Gao nod. I'm claiming that some cultivators have skin as hard as iron. Some do, Gao coughed. Most don't. Depends on type of cultivation. Not relevant anyway. Most of the trouble came from the lower tiers. Disciples that got too big for their boots, don't have iron skin, just strong and fast. And most cultivators never make it past... The man coughed, wiping away a drop of bloody phlegm that seeped from his mouth. Still, he continued on, determination in his flagging voice. Initiate. The last word was barely a whisper, yet it echoed round the room like the banging of a bell. Master Johansson said nothing, merely staring at the young former guard. His helm gave no indication of his expression. That didn't stop Kang from imagining the worst, though. Imagining how they were all going to die for Gao spouting such taboo. Then the cultivator simply stood up, sliding the black device like the one the mayor had used before across the table. Alright, you're all dismissed. When you're rested up enough to leave, press the button on the side of this device. I will come collect you and Jim will find housing for you. Report back here first thing tomorrow. Kang relaxed in his seat as the man simply walked off after he'd said his bit, the strange mystic doors of his sanctum opening and closing for him. Then he turned around and slugged Gao in the gut. The mouthy bastard's surprised wheezing was an excellent boon for his frazzled nerves.